So the answer to this question, it's a good question. Why is it, one could claim, that in Russia and in Ukraine and the former Soviet Union today, the efforts of ISKCON, which are very much in a, we could call traditional Indian, or let's just be generous, a traditional Vedic presentation, where a strong emphasis is put on the wearing of dhotis and kurtas, and men having shaved heads with their shikas, even if they're grihastas, and the women preferably, highly preferably wearing saris, without which one is barred from performing all sorts of services, ranging from even distributing prasadam in an outdoor tent at a festival like the Bhakti Sangama festival or the Sadhu Sangha festival, of which I had the good fortune to attend several times over the years, to what to speak of entering into the deity room. Of course, let's not even speak about going on the altar. And this includes, of course, what you have to wear to get married, what you have to wear in order to lead a kirtan, to give a class, on your, at festivals and so on. So why is it that in Russia, where comparatively we could say a lot of devotees, a lot of people are quote unquote joining, are becoming devotees, are converting to Gaudiya Vaishnavism with a very Indian presentation, how come it's working there? And therefore, does that not delegitimize the argument that people from the Krishna West point of view, or from the Stanistitaha, I would say, 10th canto, chapter 4, verse 13, my friends, this is such an important verse, the third line, Stanistitaha, while remaining established while remaining situated in one's established social situation. Perspective, doesn't that delegitimize that? So a few thoughts come to mind. First of all, what kind of who's joining, who's becoming members of ISKCON? Don't kill the messenger here. I heard from reliable sources, and I hesitate to mention who, but one of the top leaders, at least in ISKCON Russia. Now, perhaps you could say that in ISKCON Ukraine, it's a whole different story. I don't think so. I think the same sort of demographics become interested in Krishna consciousness in both those countries, in spite of their, fratricidal current war, which is very unfortunate. That reliable source told me verbatim, and this is one of the most senior, if not the most senior devotee in the entire ISKCON Russian Yatra, that the large majority of people who come to ISKCON in Russia are from the lower rungs of the social ladder. Mostly, if we're going to use a Varnashram, classification, mostly from the Shudra classification. Can Shudras become Uttamadhikaris? Absolutely. Are all souls ultimately beyond Varna consideration and are, pure lovers of Krishna? Absolutely. Are we happy with anyone, regardless of their conditioning, rich or poor or this or that, coming to ISKCON? Of course we are. At the same time, we cannot be overly transcendental in the sense of being more Catholic than the Pope. Prabhupada made distinctions, and so we should also. He was careful about what kind of demographics. He was observant, at least. For example, he said, we have the Mass, we want the class. So if Prabhupada could have these serious concerns, why shouldn't his followers? Lord Chaitanya, we see, preached to the masses as well as to highly intellectual Brahmins. So both are obviously needed. But Prabhupada did say, we have the Mass, we want the class. So I often reply to that question, because sometimes you hear devotees say, oh, well, at the Sadhu Sangha festival or the Bhakti Sangama festival, there were 9,000 devotees. Ooh. Well, how about this? What if, since 40 years of preaching Krishna consciousness in those countries, the leaders had not been fanatical, obsessive about putting on a sari and putting on a dhoti on every single member of ISKCON, even when it's minus 20 Celsius outside, as a small parenthesis, well, just to finish this thought, then maybe we would not have 9,000 people at this Bhakti Sangama festival. Maybe we'd have, 40,000 people, because something is to be said about the nature, again, without making overgeneralizations, but even Prabhupada, again, noticed the nature of Russians and, that Slavic vibe or that Slavic gene, which is quite favorable to spirituality and devotion and piety and, certain austerities and the service of the Lord and so on. Maybe there would be 40,000, 50,000 by this time. Right? So we shouldn't sit on our laurels, as we say. So as a small parenthesis, I was saying, I have a friend who told me, literally, this is a true story, that sometimes on Harinam, when devotees go out and chant Hare Krishna in the public, in Moscow, for example, and it's minus 20 degrees Celsius, True story. You have these like old grandmas. They're called babushkas, right? It's just a common way to say the word grandma, who literally walk up to the men who are wearing warm long johns on which they put their tropical dhotis on. I mean, who is telling them this? Who is telling them that no, dhotis are so important that even if it's minus 20 Celsius when you go out and chant Hare Krishna in public, the dhoti is so important. But, we understand it. It's really thin, so you'll be kind of cold. So put on some long johns, which then looks even more ridiculous because you have these blue or dark blue or black long johns with a dhoti on top. So you have these old grandmas who come and say, my dear son, here, take 100 rubles or however, the equivalent of $10 here. Please, please take this and buy yourself some warm clothes. That's the reaction to the nonverbal preaching of Harinam Sankirtan in those countries, because someone in the higher echelons is obsessed and thinks that, oh, no, in order to practice Krishna consciousness, you have to wear those dhotis, you have to wear those saris. So number one, who's joining? What's the caliber? Again, we're not putting into question the sincerity, the genuine honesty and sincerity of heart of all the super sincere hundreds of thousands of devotees who have joined. But we can also not be blind and avoid to analyze, okay, what's the material, quote unquote, caliber of the people who do join. Another issue, I think, which is important. Russia and Ukraine do not have the same demographic issue as the Western countries vis-a-vis a Indian diaspora. Remember, in the 19s, the huge influx of immigrants coming from India, at least in the United States, only started in the late 1980s. And now, as in England, out of the whole population of, let's say, Canada, America, or Western Europe, it's more or less kind of the same everywhere, maybe more in America and Canada, but it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's anywhere between 1% and 3% of the entire population of a country. That's significant. It's still tiny, and therefore, if ISKCON is only spreading effectively within that tiny niche, we have a serious problem, which we do, because ISKCON is basically only growing within that niche. So however successful the preaching is within that niche, we're still stuck within that 1% to 3% of the whole population. And we can kiss goodbye the prediction of Lord Chaitanya of every town and village, right? And Prabhupada's wish that Krishna consciousness be adopted by local people. As a small parenthesis again, when Prabhupada, one of these my favorite quotes, when Prabhupada received a photograph of the devotees posing in front of the main door of the newly rented or perhaps purchased ISKCON center in Geneva, Switzerland, Prabhupada mentioned, and this is confirmed by the current GBC and temple president of ISKCON Zurich, I had heard it from a few other devotees before, Prabhupada asked, very nice, but how many of these devotees are locals? When Prabhupada went to Nairobi, and Brahmananda, at that time Swami, who had been sent by Prabhupada there a few months earlier, was taking Prabhupada to one Gujarati family or one Indian family after another, day after day after day, several times a day. After the third or fourth day, Prabhupada, it's mentioned in the Lilamrita, Bhakti Charu Swami used to quote this all the time. Prabhupada said, did I come to Africa to preach to the Indians? So in other words, of course, Indians are welcome. Any soul is welcome to Lord Chaitanya's movement, but we cannot, again, ignore demographics. So Ukraine and Russia have a very tiny percentage of the society made up of Indians from the Indian diaspora. The percentage, the slice of the cake of the entire population is much, much smaller, consisting of Indian immigrants than that as we see in England, in Canada, in North America. But what's interesting is that this problem, quote unquote, that ISKCON is facing in the West with a growing Indian diaspora and therefore a sort of for better or for worse, a takeover. Again, this is nothing against Indians. I have nothing against Indians. It's just a fact. Takeover by sincere, Vaishnava followers of Prabhupada who have Indian bodies and who end up, basically preaching to people of their own race or their own jati or their own caste, because that's what humans do. Generally, blacks preach to blacks and whites preach to white. As a matter of fact, there's a technical term for it. It's the law. It's in sociology of religion, where basically, again and again, preachers or evangelists or missionaries notice that effective preaching is done much more in terms of higher success rate within the same sort of social or cultural or racial communities. So They don't have that problem. But as I was saying, like I went to Lithuania a year or two ago, and the devotees there were complaining to me at the Vilnius temple, and I saw it with my own eyes. They have this tiny little temple on Sunday. I mean, and on Sunday feast, the local devotees literally have nowhere to go because the temple, as small as it is packed with, sincere, pious, and of course they're welcome members of the Indian diaspora, honoring Krishna Prasadam, and glory to them for doing so. But the problem that devotees in the West are kind of ringing the alarm bell about that, hey, ISKCON has been taken over by Indians, and we, the few white devotees, from a Christian background, what are we going to do about it, or what are we going to do to increase people from our own race and our own cultural background to come join ISKCON again, as they did in large quantities back in the 60s and 70s. They're not faced with that question so much in Ukraine and Russia. You see what I mean? They're not faced with that problem. So when that problem slowly will come, and if Indian immigration continues to grow over there, maybe they'll reach that problem. When they come to a point where they realize, as many of us are realizing today, holy cow, all the temple presidents of ISKCON North America are Indians. All the congregation members on a Sunday, 99% are Indians. And, for example, I have a friend called, I won't mention his name, but we have a game that we send each other videos of a Ratha Yatra in New York, or a Janmashtami in Toronto, or whatever. And the game is spot the white devotee. Spot the white devotee. Because you can't see. Oh, here's one at minute 3.2, there's one white girl. Oh, here at minute 4.3, there's one black guy. Oh, look over there at minute 6.2, I saw two Latino-looking guys. And the large majority are Indians. Again, nothing wrong with Indians coming to Krishna consciousness. Obviously, we're not our bodies, but they don't have that problem yet, quote unquote, or this issue in ISKCON Russia and Ukraine. But maybe, when their temples start getting taken over by members of the Indian diaspora, then the question will come, okay, what do we need to adjust? What do we hold as sacred and we do not even touch? Like, load-bearing walls are principles, Rupa Goswami, principles and details. What are the principles we keep sacred and we don't touch, however unpopular they may be? No sex outside of marriage, and ideally for procreation. That's a principle that most people, have a hard time following, even if they believe in it. What to speak of accepting it? What to speak of, being in favor of it? But hey, those are non-negotiables that our tradition, insists on. So even if it makes us unpopular in the eyes of a lot of people out there, sorry, these are non-negotiable principles. But what can we adjust in terms of details? So I think Russia and Ukraine have a lot of people joining. Again, who's joining? How many would join in a lot larger number if we didn't, present ourselves all exotic and folkloric and, exotic and Indian folkloric to begin with, probably a lot more. And furthermore, they're not there yet. They don't have this issue of a takeover of ISKCON by the Indian diaspora yet. Maybe it'll happen. Maybe it won't happen. But those are the two main points that I can think of to answer that question. Just because the context is so different in Russia and Ukraine than it is in the West, doesn't mean that what we see with our own eyes in the West, namely that those centers, those preachers in, majority white context, white niches, white demographics, white from Christian background demographics, culturally speaking, have a lot more success in attracting other whites and, minorities in that same niche, like blacks and Latinos, islanders in Australia or New Zealand and so on. And forgive me if we forgot, even smaller minorities. They have a lot more success, attracting them into the fold than when the presentation is all out Indian. I mean, that's been seen again and again across the Western world. So so that these facts and these demographic these facts cannot be denied or nullified just because there's a lot of people, and again, what kind of people and blah blah blah, joining in Russia and Ukraine, where the Indian diaspora is practically non-existent. Hare Krishna, Glory to Prabhupada.